Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Legends of Smooth Jazz for Saturday, February 25th, 2023. Episode 7 is upon us tonight, and we're picking up where we left off with a look at the man who has graced us with great music, a great voice, and a horn that sounds so sweet it just mellows down into it. Yep, that's for sure. His voice is what made him really a legacy legend in his own right. And even though we lost him at the age of 69, well, Louis Armstrong still rings in our minds of what a wonderful world it really is. And we'll look at part 2 of this great legend of smooth jazz tonight on the Legends of Smooth Jazz. Welcome to this edition. I'm your host, Jason Icanio, ready to go for another look at the Legends of Smooth Jazz, continuing on with part 2 of Louis Armstrong. All right. Hope you had a great week, and this is another look back at everything that we had talked about from the first part. And we're going to look at part 2 and pick up where we left off. Remember, all of our information, as we didn't mention before, comes from the Wikipedia. So you can follow along with us as we look at the timeline. We're still in Louis' career, and we're going to pick up where we left off. So Armstrong also played with Erskine Tate's Little Symphony, which played mostly at the Vendome Theater. Now, they furnished music for silent movies and live shows, including jazz versions of classical music, such as Madame Butterfly, which gave Armstrong experience with longer forms of music and with hosting before a large audience. He began scat singing, improvised vocal jazz using nonsensical words, and was among the first to record it on the Hot 5 recording Heebie Jeebies in 1926. The recording was so popular that the group became the most famous jazz band in the United States, even though they had seldom performed live. Young musicians across the country, black or white, were turned on by Armstrong's new type of jazz. After separating from Lil, Armstrong started to play at the Sunset Cafe for Al Capone's associate, Joe Glazer, in the Carol Dickerson Orchestra, with Earl Hines on piano, which was renamed Louis Armstrong and His Stompers, though Hines was the musical director and Glazer managed the orchestra. Hines and Armstrong became fast friends and successful collaborators. It was at the Sunset Cafe that Armstrong accompanied singer Adelaide Hall, and it was during Hall's tenure at the venue that she experimented, developed, and expanded her scat singing with Armstrong's guidance and encouragement. In the first half of 1927, Armstrong assembled his Hot 7 group, which added drummer Al Baby Dodds and tuba player Pete Briggs, while preserving most of his original Hot 5 lineup. John Thomas replaced Kid Ory on trombone. Later that year, he organized a series of new Hot 5 sessions, which resulted in 9 more records. And in the last half of 1928, he started recording with a new group, Zuddy Singleton on the drums, Earl Hines on the piano, Jimmy Strong on the clarinet, Fred Robinson trombone, and Mancy Carr on the banjo. Armstrong made a huge impact during the 1920s Harlem Renaissance. His music touched well-known writer Langston Hughes, and Hughes admired Armstrong and acknowledged him as one of the most recognized musicians of the era. Hughes wrote many books that celebrated jazz and recognized Armstrong as one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance's newfound love of African-American culture. The sound of jazz, along with musicians such as Armstrong, helped shape Hughes as a writer. And just like the musicians, Hughes wrote his words with jazz. Armstrong changed jazz during the Harlem Renaissance. And as the world's greatest trumpet player during this time, Armstrong cemented his legacy and continued a focus on his vocal career. His popularity brought together many black and white audiences. Louis Armstrong, he returned to New York in 1929, where he played in the pit orchestra for the musical Hot Chocolates, an all-black revue written by Andy Razzoff and pianist Fats Waller. He made a cameo appearance as a vocalist, regularly stealing the show with his rendition of Ain't Misbehavin', and his version of the song became his biggest-selling record yet. Armstrong started to work at Connie's Inn in Harlem, chief rival to the Cotton Club, a venue for elaborately staged floor shows, and a front for gangster Dutch Schultz. Armstrong had considered success with vocal recordings, including versions of songs composed by his old friend Hoagy Carmichael. His 1930s recording took full advantage of the RCA ribbon microphone introduced in 1931, which imparted warmth to vocals and became an intrinsic part of the crooning sound of artists like Bing Crosby. Armstrong's interpretation of Carmichael's Stardust became one of the most successful versions of this song ever recorded, showcasing Armstrong's unique vocal sound and style and his innovative approach to singing songs that were already standards. Armstrong's radical reworking of Sidney Oridan and Carmichael's Lazy River, recorded in 1931, encapsulated his groundbreaking approach to melody and phrasing. The song begins with a brief trumpet solo, then the main melody is introduced by sobbing horns, memorably punctuated by Armstrong's growling interjections at the end of each bar. Yeah, sure, way down, way down. In the first verse, he ignores the notated melody and sings as if playing a trumpet solo, pitching most of the first line on a single note and using strongly syncopated phrasing. In the second stanza, he breaks into an almost fully improvised melody, which then evolves into a classic passage of Armstrong's scat singing. As with his trumpet playing, Armstrong's vocal innovations served as a foundation for jazz vocal interpretation. This uniquely, gravely coloration of his voice became an archetype that was endlessly imitated, and his scat singing was enriched by his matchless experience as a trumpet soloist. His resonant, velvety low-register tone and bubbling cadences on sides such as Lazy River exerted a huge influence on younger white singers such as Bing Crosby. Now, the Great Depression of the early 1930s was especially hard on the jazz scene. The Cotton Club closed in 1936 after a long downward spiral, and many musicians stopped playing altogether as club dates evaporated. Bix Beiderbecke died, and Fletcher Henderson's band broke up. King Oliver made a few records, but otherwise struggled. Sidney Bett became a tailor, later moving to Paris, and Kid Ory returned to New Orleans and raised chickens. Armstrong moved to Los Angeles in 1930 to seek new opportunities. He played at the New Cotton Club in Los Angeles with Lionel Hampton on drums. The band drew the Hollywood crowd, which could still afford a lavish nightlife, while radio broadcasts from the club connected with younger audiences at home. Bing Crosby and many other celebrities were regulars at the club, and in 1931, Armstrong appeared in his first movie, X-Flame, and was also convicted of marijuana possession, but received a suspended sentence. He returned to Chicago in late 1931 and played in bands more in the Guy Lombardo vein, and he recorded more standards. When the mob insisted that he get out of town, Armstrong visited New Orleans, had a hero's welcome, and saw old friends. He sponsored a local baseball team known as Armstrong's Secret Nine and had a cigar named after him. But soon, he was on the road again. After a tour across the country, shadowed by the mob, he fled to Europe. After returning to the States, he undertook several exhausting tours, and his agent Johnny Collins' erratic behavior and his own spending ways left Armstrong short of cash. Breach of contract violations plagued him. He hired Joe Glazer as his new manager, a tough mob-connected wheeler-dealer who began to straighten out his legal mess, mob troubles, and debts. Armstrong also began to experience problems with his fingers and lips, aggravated by his unorthodox playing style. And as a result, he branched out, developing his vocal style and making his first theatrical appearances. He appeared in movies again, including Crosby's 1936 hit Pennies from Heaven, and then in 1937, he substituted for Rudy Valley on the CBS radio network and became the first African American to host a sponsored national broadcast. Well, after spending many years on the road, Armstrong settled permanently in Queens, New York in 1943 in contentment with his fourth wife, Lucille. And although subject to the vicissitudes of Tin Pan Alley and the gangster-written music business, as well as anti-black prejudice, he continued to develop his playing. Bookings for bands tapered off during the 1940s due to changes in public tastes. Ballrooms closed, and there was competition for other types of music, especially pop vocals, becoming more popular than big band music. It became impossible under such circumstances to finance a 16-piece touring band. A widespread revival of interest in the 1940s and the traditional jazz of the 1920s made it possible for Armstrong to consider a return to the small group musical style of his youth. Armstrong was featured as a guest artist with Lionel Hampton's band at the famed Second Cavalcade of Jazz concert held at Wrigley Field in Los Angeles, produced by Leon Heflin Sr. on October 12, 1946. He also led a highly successful small group jazz concert at New York's Town Hall on May 17th of 1947, featuring Armstrong with trombonist singer Jack Teagarden. During the concert, Armstrong and Teagarden performed a duet on Hoagy Carmichael's Rockin' Chair. They then recorded for OK Records. Armstrong's manager, Joe Glazer, changed the Armstrong Big Band on August 13, 1947, into a six-piece traditional jazz group featuring Armstrong with initially Teagarden, Earl Hines, and other top swing and Dixieland musicians, most of whom were previously leaders of big bands. The new group was announced at the opening of Billy Berg's Supper Club. This smaller group was called Louis Armstrong and his All-Stars and included at various times Earl Father Hines, Barney Bigard, Edmund Hall, Jack Teagarden, Trummy Young, Arvell Shaw, Billy Kyle, Marty Napoleon, Big Sid Buddy Catlett, Cozy Cole, Tyree Glenn, Barrett Deems, Mort Herbert, Joe Darrensburg, Eddie Shue, Joe Morinari, Joe Morani, and percussionist Danny Barcelona. Then on February 28, 1948, Susie Delaire sang the French song C'est Bon at the Hotel Negresco during the first Nice Jazz Festival. Louis Armstrong was present and loved the song. June 26, 1950, he recorded the American version of the song, English lyrics by Jerry Saline, in New York City with Cy Oliver and his orchestra. When it was released, the disc was a worldwide success, and the song was then performed by the greatest international singers. He was the first jazz musician to appear on the cover of Time magazine on February 21, 1949. And Louis Armstrong and his All-Stars were featured at the 9th Cavalcade of Jazz concert, also at Wrigley Field, in Los Angeles, produced by Leon Heflin Sr., held on June 7, 1953, along with Shorty Rogers, Roy Brown, Don Tosti, and his Mexican jazzmen Earl Bostic and Nat King Cole. Over 30 years, Armstrong played more than 300 performances a year, making many recordings and appearing in over 30 films. By the 1950s, Armstrong was a widely beloved American icon and cultural ambassador who commanded an international fan base. However, a growing generation gap became apparent between him and the young jazz musicians who emerged in the post-war era, such as Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and Sonny Rollins. The post-war generation regarded their music as abstract art and considered Armstrong's vaudevillian style, half musician and half stage entertainer, outmoded and Uncle Tomism. He seemed a link to minstrelsy that we were ashamed of. He called bebop Chinese music. And while touring Australia in 1954, he was asked if he could play bebop. Bebop, he husked? I just play music. Guys who invent terms like that are walking the streets with their instruments under their arms. In the 60s, he toured Ghana and Nigeria. And after finishing his contract with Decca Records, he went freelance and recorded for other labels. He continued an intense international touring schedule, but in 1959 he suffered a heart attack in Italy and had to rest. In 1964, after over 2 years without setting foot in a studio, he recorded his biggest-selling record, Hello Dolly, a song by Jerry Herman, originally sung by Carol Channing. Armstrong's version remained on the Hot 100 for 22 weeks, longer than any other record produced that year, and went to number 1, making him at 62 years, 9 months, and 5 days, the oldest person to accomplish that feat. His hit dislodged the Beatles from the number 1 position they had occupied for 14 consecutive weeks with 3 different songs. Armstrong toured well into his 60s, even visiting part of the communist bloc in 1965. And he also toured Africa, Europe, and Asia under the sponsorship of the United States State Department with great success, earning the nickname Ambassador Satch and inspiring Dave Brubeck to compose his jazz musical, The Real Ambassadors. By 1968, he was approaching 70, and his health was failing. His heart and kidney ailments forced him to stop touring, and he did not perform publicly in 1969 and spent most of the year recuperating at home. Meanwhile, his longtime manager, Joe Glazier, died, and by the summer of 1970, his doctors pronounced him fit enough to resume live performances. He embarked on another world tour, but a heart attack forced him to take a break for 2 months. Armstrong made his last recorded trumpet performances on his 1968 album, Disney Songs The Satchmo Way. The Louis Armstrong House Museum website states, judging from home-recorded tapes, now in our museum collections, Louis pronounced his own name as Louis, and on his 1964 record, Hello Dolly, he sings, "This is Louis, Dolly," but in 1933, he made a record called Laughin' Louie. Many broadcast announcers, fans, and acquaintances called him Louie, and in a videotaped interview from 1983, Lucille Armstrong calls her late husband Louie as well. Musicians and close friends usually called him Pops. In a memoir written for Robert Goffin between 1943 and 1944, Armstrong stated, "All white folks call me Louie," suggesting that he himself did not, or that no whites addressed him by one of his nicknames, such as Pops. That said, Armstrong was registered as Louie for the 1920 U.S. Census. On various live records, he is called Louie on stage, such as on the 1952 Can Anyone Explain? From the live album In Scandinavia, Volume 1. The same applies to his 1952 studio recording of the song Chloe, where the choir in the background sings Louie, Louie, with Armstrong responding, "What was that? Somebody called my name?" Louie is the French pronunciation of Louis and is commonly used in Louisiana. Armstrong was performing at the Brick House in Gretna, Louisiana, when he met Daisy Parker, a local prostitute, and started an affair as a client. He returned to Gretna on several occasions to visit her, and he found the courage to look for her home to see her away from work. There he found out she had a common-law husband, and not long after that fiasco, Parker traveled to Armstrong's home on Perdido Street. They checked into Kid Green's hotel that evening. On the next day, March 19, 1919, Armstrong and Parker married at City Hall. They adopted a 3-year-old boy, Clarence, whose mother, Armstrong's cousins, Flora, had died soon after giving birth. Clarence Armstrong was mentally disabled as a result of a head injury at an early age, and Armstrong spent the rest of his life taking care of him. His marriage to Parker ended when they separated in 1923. February 4th, 1924, he married Lil Hardin Armstrong, King Oliver's pianist. She had divorced her first husband a few years later, and his second wife helped him develop his career, but they separated in 1931 and divorced in 1938. Armstrong then married Alpha Smith, and his relationship with Alpha began while he was playing at the Vendome during the 1920s and continued long after. His marriage to her lasted 4 years. They divorced in 1942, And Louis then married Lucille Wilson, a singer at the Cotton Club in New York, in October of 1942. They remained married until his death in 1971. Armstrong's marriages produced no offspring. However, in December of 2012, a 57-year-old Sharon Preston Folta claimed to be his daughter from a 1950s affair between Armstrong and Lucille Sweets Preston. Where does that even come in? It's Sweets Preston is a dancer at the Cotton Club. And in a 1955 letter to his manager, Joe Glazer, Armstrong affirmed him that the Preston's newborn baby was his daughter, and that ordered Glazer to pay a monthly allowance of $400 or $5,058 in 2021 dollars to mother and child. Whoa, heavy stuff. So Armstrong was colorful and charismatic. His autobiography vexed some biographers and historians because he had a habit of telling tales, particularly about his early childhood when he was less scrutinized and his embellishments lacked consistency. In addition to being an entertainer, he was a leading personality. He was beloved by an American public that usually offered little access beyond their public celebrity to even the greatest African-American performers. And he was able to live a private life of access. So, let's see. Where are we going now? Okay. And he generally remained politically neutral, which at times alienated him from members of the black community, who expected him to use his prominence within white America to become more outspoken during the civil rights movement. However, he did criticize President Eisenhower for not acting forcefully enough on civil rights. Okay, now let's go into here. The trumpet is notoriously hard on the lips, and Armstrong suffered from lip damage over most of his life. This was due to his aggressive style of playing and preference for narrow mouthpieces that would stay in place more easily, but which tended to dig into the soft flesh of his inner lip. During his 1930s European tour, he suffered an ulceration so severe that he had to stop playing entirely for a year. Eventually, he took to using salves and creams on his lips and also cutting off scar tissue with a razor blade. By the 1950s, he was an official spokesman for Ansatz Cream Lip Salve. Okay. So, during a backstage meeting with trombonist Marshall Brown in 1959, Armstrong received a suggestion to see a doctor and receive proper treatment for his lips instead of relying on home remedies. But he did not get around to that until his final years, by which point his health was failing and the doctors considered surgery too risky. Also in 1959, he was hospitalized for pneumonia while on tour in Italy. Doctors were concerned about his lungs and heart, but by June 26th, he rallied. And we're going to stop there and pick up the next time with nicknames. We'll look at his race, his religion, personal habits, writings, social organizations, horn playing, and early jazz, and all the good stuff that you love to seek. That's getting our stuff back as we see it. So, we will, of course, look at all of that on the next time that we get together. All right, so we'll take a look at that next week as we go into March. Should be fun. All right, so we'll pick up, yeah. So we'll look at nicknames on the next time, race, religion, and all that good stuff on episode 8 of the Legends of Smooth Jazz. I'm Jason DeCanio, thanking you very much for this great edition tonight. Look at our past episodes. Check out that Buddy Rich episode. It's getting close to 400 views, folks. Thank you. And if you have not subscribed to the YouTube channel, we'll put the link down in the description so that you have an opportunity to definitely take part and become part of the Legends of Smooth Jazz family. I'm Jason DeCanio, thanking you once again. Have a great night. And remember, be honest, be real, and keep it simple, stupid. Kiss. We will see you next week. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next weekend. Have a great week. For now, bye-bye.
Don't forget to subscribe to the David3000 Network for great more content like this one.